I'm Lauren Horn, creator of This Is Not a Sketchbook and art educator for almost a decade, and today we're going to talk about the grid method. Just like in my classroom, I'd like to start this video off by asking if you have any good things you want to share today. Doesn't have to be a big thing. If you've got a little thing going on that's bringing you joy, make sure you put it in the comments below. We're going to talk about the grid method, but we're specifically going to talk about how to grid a photograph, which is the basis of what I use for a lot of my projects in my classroom. If you haven't already, make sure you go back and watch my videos on value and creating a good reference photo. Without a good reference photo, this method isn't going to work very well. The grid method is something a lot of famous artists use. It's a way to break down a really big problem into smaller bite-sized pieces. The worksheet we're going to look at today is one that I created for teachers to use in their classrooms. But if you're an aspiring artist yourself and you don't have access to this worksheet, my favorite thing to do is to go grab a piece of mail and find a logo or a stamp or something in the corner, and you're going to draw a box and you're going to try to transfer that logo over. The first thing that we're going to look at is a SAM square. SAM stands for Sighting, Angles, and Mapping, and it's a tool that I use in my book to start training your brain to seeing angles, shapes, and their relationship to each other. In a SAM square, the goal is to copy it over exactly, not just similar. It needs to be the exact same. And the way that I do that is kind of breaking this down and mapping out different areas in order to give me more tools that are going to help be accurate. So I kind of like to divide up the sides almost like they're a fraction. So I'm going to go ahead and make a little halfway point here, halfway point here. Try not to look at the object itself, just looking at this line here and here. And I'm going to do the same over here in our drawing space. Remember, if you're doing this from home, grab a logo, do a box around it, and do another box, and then try to copy the same thing. You can also ask a friend to do a quick doodle, draw a box around it, draw a similar shaped box, and transfer that over as well. So when I'm looking at the SAM square, I'm looking at, okay, this is the halfway mark. Now, what's halfway to halfway? It's about right here. This line starts a little inside the halfway mark. So I'm going to go over here and make it halfway to halfway. And I know that this line is going to start somewhere right about here. I can double check the bottom to make sure that it's the same, and it is. So now I can go ahead and really lightly, working really light, but confidently is a great way to start. If you're making a mark too dark, too quick, then you're going to want to go back and change it, and you won't be able to. You might be tempted here to use a ruler, and I want to encourage you not to, because what we're doing is we're training our hand-eye coordination, and if we're using ruler, I'm not getting the full effect of what you could be doing. Now the swirl is going to be a little trickier, so I'm going to look at something that we call negative space, which I'll get to more in another lesson, but I'm going to kind of glance over it. Negative space is kind of looking at the shape around the object. So if this swirly mark is our object, I'm looking at the way this triangle is formed right here. And it's bumping into our horizontal line that we made earlier. And I'm going to just kind of think about drawing that triangle rather than drawing the line itself. And I think if that's my triangle, and then I see this little triangle down here, these are all clues that's going to help get me where I need to be. Now the line actually almost disappears behind this edge of the square. So I'm not going to worry about drawing it all the way down. I'm just going to kind of guide and realize it goes about halfway. And then I think it ends. I made that mark not right in the middle. And again, I'm going to look at kind of a combination between the negative space and looking at the outside edges here. And I'm going to see, okay, I think it's going to connect back down somewhere around here. Okay. Now this row, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm looking at this negative space right here, which is that kind of triangle shape. And I'm saying, okay, it's going to bump in here under the halfway mark, kind of hide behind the edge of the square, and pop back out right here. Now I'm looking at the distance right here between the intersection here and the intersection of that curvy line. I know it needs to be somewhere over here. Now this is the harder part because it's kind of floating into space. It's not touching any one of the sides, so we have less clues. So what I'm going to do is kind of make a line where it ends here and where the kind of tip the curlicue is here. Now I can kind of make those same guidelines here. And I can use those to help kind of inform myself. I'm going to do another one right here. See how far out does this curlicue go. And now I can kind of use this to say, okay, I know it's going to go out, bump against here, and kind of curl back around this way. something's not quite right about the shape. And the way that you kind of test yourself is by flicking your eyes back and forth between the two. It's kind of like those old magazine games where I would say what's different in this picture and this picture, and you look back and forth and try to find the missing or the different objects. That's the same thing you really do when you're drawing, is you look at the reference photo, you look at your drawing, and you try to find what's the difference. So for me, this angle is really kind of crazy looking. So, oh yeah, if you look, I made this line way far away from the center when it should be much closer. I'm gonna bring that in. Now I can change my guide and know that really this line is going to curl here, but it's gonna bump up much higher over this way. And it looks really messy right now, but that's kind of what you want. You want to have like a bunch of lines there to kind of guide you, and then you can adjust from there. Now that I'm a little bit more confident where my line is, I can focus on the line weight, which is how thin or thick a line is. We're going to talk a lot about line weight in a future project. There we go. That's how we do a SAM square. I could spend hours kind of perfecting this, but I just want you to understand how we use different tools to help map out our lines and our angles and how we see the relationship between each other. So when we do a grid, basically what we're doing is we're breaking down the photo into tiny little SAM squares. So let's look at this duck. Basically, this duck as a whole, if I handed you a piece of paper and I said, go draw this, it might be hard to draw it completely accurately. You can maybe get close, but it wouldn't be exactly right. I use grids a lot when I'm drawing portraits or when I'm drawing houses because those tiny little imperfections really change the overall view of something. So again, even though this duck could get close, we want to make it exact. So I can look at this, and this is labeled ABC 1, 2, 3, so that this is square A1, this is square B1, this is square A2. This might help as you go through just to make sure that you're on the right square the whole time you're doing it. On this worksheet, I also created some viewfinders. I'm going to cut these out in a second, but basically what this is going to do is help us only look at one square at a time. Now that my viewfinders are cut, I'm ready to take this grid and break it down into a series of SAM squares. If you're at home and then you don't have access to this worksheet, you can use Post-it notes to create little windows. Use 4 Post-it notes around every edge, and it's really nice. You can lift it up and put it back down again. So I'm going to break this first one down into my first SAM square, and I'm going to do the same over here. Sometimes you might not need to have 2, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. So if I'm looking at this like a SAM square, I can see that basically we only see a tiny bit of the duck here. This is going to be a really quick drawing. There's a little bit of space right here, and then the line starts all the way up here and then bumps into a secondary line right here. So I'm going to do my secondary line first. These lines are really thick, and if you try to work with thin lines, it might not match up the same way that you want it to. So I'd say go ahead and match the line weight now. And there's my first line. Now, which direction you go is up to you. You can go up and down, you can go side to side. I just wouldn't hop all over the place. So I'm gonna move just to the next square right here, just to the next square right here. And I purposely made these windows a tiny bit bigger because it is nice to see a little bit of the edge of where you started. For instance, I can see the edge here coming up from the duck, and I know that this is where his nose is gonna start. Now again, I'm looking at the negative space on the top. So I'm kind of looking at that triangle of white rather than looking at the line itself. I'm looking at where it bumps into the edge of this square. I'm going to move these viewfinders around and continue drawing my duck. Of course, this is sped up, so don't feel like you have to rush. Go really slow and make sure each box is perfect. Now I've got a great accurate representation of this duck, and I did it by breaking it down into smaller squares. I want to teach you to use the same methods on a reference photo, hopefully one that you've taken. Flip your page over and we're going to work from the reference photo at the back. If you're at home, just use any great reference photo, and if you can't find one, make sure you reference back my Taking Good Reference Photos videos and you can take your own. Our first step into gridding a photograph is to map out your values. I've talked in previous videos about identifying value shapes. Now you're going to physically do that. If you have a colored pencil, this is a great time to use it. If not, usually a graphite pencil works fine, especially because it's a little shinier than the paper. But I got this teal pencil right here. And my first step, because our grid is already made, is to go through and I'm going to try to find out where the shift in values are, and I'm going to make a line. The more work you do here, the kind of easier your drawing is. So you could rush through this, but you're going to have a harder time later on. If you're at home, remember you can grab any photo. And in the next step here, I'm going to teach you how to make your own grid. Obviously, with this worksheet, you're going to have a grid over top of your drawing. We're going to get to that soon, I promise. So I'm going to go through and look at this orange, and I see a big shift in value right here between this light part of the orange and the shadow. So I'm going to go through and right over top of my drawing, I'm going to identify, okay, I think the shift happens somewhere like this. There's also some bright highlights over here. Now the orange is textured and you could get really picky about each of these little spots. I'm going to identify some of the bigger ones, but you don't have to get every single one right now. Now your next step is to transfer the value map that you just did. That was called value mapping. You're going to transfer the value map to the drawing space. So I'm going to put aside this pencil. I'm going to grab my number 2. And just like we did before with the duck, trying not to see the shading right now, trying to think about it like a cartoon, you're going to start transferring over each one of your values. The pressure of your pencil here matters. You don't want to go too dark and too heavy because then you're going to see these outlines that we did. You also don't want to go so light that when we shade, you lose it. So just make sure you're controlling the pressure of your pencil. Not too dark, not too light. So my first line is right here. And don't forget, you have these viewfinders. They should work perfectly on the back of your paper as well. I'm going to skip them for now. I'm a little bit more practiced. There are kind of 2 different ways to use a grid system. So one, I call it line chasing, and one is square by square. I do a little bit more line chasing where I'll follow one edge of value or contour, whatever I'm doing, and I'll use the grid as a guide, but I'll make sure that line gets finished. For instance, this little line right here, this value edge, I'm going to go ahead and chase it down into the second grid. And I'm using the grid that I'm on to help guide me. And now I'm going to go back and follow this line. So you're kind of working the shape rather than just working the square. Your first step is to double check to make sure that you have all the value shapes in place, especially if you're like me and you chase your lines. I almost forgot this whole section right here of value. I'm glad I double checked and I can look back and complete that. If we made our own grid, this is the part where we would erase the grid so that we're just left with the value shapes. For right now, we're going to go ahead and move to the 2 value step, and this is a really vital part of most of my projects, so make sure you pay attention and follow along. I'm going to make a value scale just like I did in my value video. I'm going to go ahead and speed this process up because if you need to reference back to that, you can. The reason why we do the 2 value step is to make sure that we have really good contrast in our overall drawing. So we need to make sure that our darks stay dark and our lights stay light. This is really hard to do when you're working on a really big drawing because sometimes you work really local, and in comparison, what's your dark spot in that one little area, you might accidentally make too dark and then you lose the overall contrast. So for instance, if we were drawing these oranges and I was just working on this part of the orange right here, I might accidentally shade this shadow too dark. But if we kind of zoom our vision back up and look at the whole thing, this is dramatically lighter than our background. So if I made that too dark, then we would lose the kind of impact that the oranges have against our almost black background. It is black background. So this is why we do this, is to kind of control our value. I'm going to use some really tricky language here. And of course, make sure that you pause it if you need to kind of take a moment and process what I'm saying. We are going to take our lightest dark and we're going to shade everything that's a dark with our lightest dark. So what this means is when we're done with the shading step, everything is either going to be white or it's going to be a 5. My 5 is my lightest dark. If you look, there's a little star above here. I'm going to shade everything that falls within this dark category with just the lightest dark. So I'm going to go through and ask myself, is this a light dark? No, this is not. I think this is in my light category, so I'm going to leave that alone. This, however, is in the dark category. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shade that part in. Remember, at this point, we're just looking at the value shapes. We're not working in each individual square. If we had made our own grid, at this point, we would have erased the grid by now. Now down here in kind of the crack where all of the oranges meet, it's a darker dark than what I have right now. But again, you need to follow the process. Trust the process. This is the 2 value steps. So even though we know this is going to be really dark, right now you're just going to shade it in with your 5 value. So this is the 2 value step complete. We have this divided into lights and darks. Now here's the rule. You can only work on top of the dark category. So we're going to be developing a range from 5 to 9 now. We don't want to touch anything that we've deemed in the light category. Don't get yourself confused and kind of go backwards and say, well, maybe this is a dark. Make your decision. We have darks, we have lights. Now let's layer on top of the darks until we get this full range of our dark values. By the way, just while we're drawing, this is a step that painters use as well. It's typically called the underpainting, but you're dividing everything between lights and darks so that when they go on top of a color, they know where their contrast is and they don't lose their value for the sake of color. Now that you're done developing your darks, you're going to go back and do the same thing with your lights. It's the same principle. You're only going to work on top of where your light category is. But because we have white paper, we're going to start by working around where we see our lightest light value. Really ask yourself here if on your drawing and future drawings, if the highlight is white. It might not be, but we're going to go ahead and pull out anything that's white on our photo today, and we're going to do one really light shade everywhere but that white. Now here's a really important rule with the 2 value step. We're going to continue layering on our light category. You can't make your darkest light be darker than your lightest dark. I'm going to say that again. You can't make your darkest light be darker than your lightest dark, meaning you can't lose track of the contrast that you have and overshade your lights so that they're competing with your darks. So your goal right now is to layer until you get to this 4 value and not go over your 5 value. So keep layering until all your values are touching, and then you're going to have a really great 1 to 9 value scale on your drawing. Now is the step where we kind of go back and analyze ourselves. And the best way to do that would be to flick your eyes back and forth and try to spot the difference. So I'm going to go back through, kind of analyze myself and darken up the areas that need to. Okay, so let's talk about a really important subject, and I always change every year how I bring this up to my students because I never know when it's a good time to talk about it. But we need to talk about implied lines. So implied lines basically say that an outline can be implied. It doesn't have to be explicitly shown. So rather than a cartoon drawing where everything has a big black border around it, we are going to show where the edge of something is by some sort of change, either a value change, a color change, or a texture change. Right now we're working in black and white, so it's going to be a value change. The simplified, what this all means is that we can tell where the edge of these oranges are because the value shifts dramatically. So we know where the edge of this orange is because there's a big value shift between here and here. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this straight line right here. I don't need to come through and press my pencil down really hard and outline the orange. What that does is kind of take away the realism of our drawing so far. What I need to do instead is make the outlines that might already exist from our value mapping kind of disappear. So if you look at these areas right here, I do have some black outlines left. So I'm going to go through and erase those. And now I'm going to come back through with my shadow, and I'm just going to kind of like butt my shadow up to those lines so that that highlight stands out. Now there's a huge one right here. Hopefully you can see it on the camera. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to erase it out, and I'm going to shade in the area around it instead. So when an outline happens where it's a dark area, sometimes you can darken up the area next to the line and the line will kind of visually disappear. The last thing I want to do is just to get some of the texture. You can see some of the dimples over here. And I'm just going to pick a couple more little areas, texture those to match the reference photos, and then I am done. Now that you understand how to work from a gridded photo, we need to teach you how to make your own grid. This might look really simple, but there's a lot of really common mistakes that happen here, so make sure you pay attention to the details, otherwise you're going to get lost. I printed out this photo as part of my micro portrait series, which you can find here. The idea of a micro portrait is that you're so zoomed in, you can kind of disassociate with your brain that you're looking at facial features, and it makes it easier to draw. So the first thing to note is that not all rulers measure the same. So this ruler starts at the very end. Some rulers start a little bit in. So you just need to look for where the beginning of that ruler starts, because it might not be the end of the physical ruler itself. Rulers also can be confusing for people who haven't used them a lot. So the first thing to note is that it's not on top of the letter on my ruler. It's usually the big line. So the big line, the very end of it, is going to mark the end of an inch. Make sure for today you're using the inch side of the ruler. Also, don't get fooled into thinking that the width of a ruler is an inch. I see kids sometimes trying to cheat the process by turning the ruler the opposite way and tracing either side of the ruler in order to get their measurements, and that's really not going to work for you. It's pretty obvious. Don't try to cheat. So I'm going to show you how to start. This is what's important to know, is that a square is a square is a square is a square is a square. So when you're measuring your reference photo, make sure that you're just worried about making perfect squares and not rectangles. If you follow these steps, you'll do it really easily. In future projects, I'm going to move up to enlarging a grid. So if you're curious about that, you can see that in some other units that I do. So I'm going to start just somewhere near the top of my reference photo. It does not need to be at the very, very top or any certain area, just somewhere near the top. And I'm going to line my ruler up with the end of my photo. And for today, I'm going to use a different color pencil just so it's a little bit easier for you guys to see. And everywhere where there's an inch mark, I'm going to make a little line or a little dot. Now we have an uneven space right here. Our picture doesn't go all the way to 4. I'm going to go ahead and make that 4 spot so that I know exactly where it is. I'm going to move it somewhere towards the bottom. It doesn't have to be at the very end of the photo. It doesn't have to be a certain amount away. I'm not doing any measuring at this point. I'm just going to put my ruler somewhere towards the end of my photo. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to measure at the 1 inch mark, 2 inch mark, 3 inch mark, 4 inch mark, making sure my ruler isn't moving at all when I'm making my marks. And that the end of my ruler is lined up with the end of my photograph, keeping in mind that not all rulers measure the same. Now I'm going to turn my ruler, and at this point we're not measuring inches anymore. We're just using the flat edge of a ruler, and I'm going to connect the first 2 dots that I made. So this was my 1 inch at the top, this was my 1 inch at the bottom, and I'm going to draw a line all the way through. I'm going to do the same thing with my 2 inch mark and my 2 inch mark. A line all the way through. This is really important at this step that you hold the ruler down, because the ruler will get pushed by the pencil and you'll end up with a crooked line if you don't. Sometimes this works great to do with a buddy if you have one. You're just going to ask them to hold the ruler down and you're going to make the line. And remember, we're going to make this last line all the way over here, even though it's off of our photo. So your line should look really parallel, and sometimes when we're working on a desk that's flat in front of us, it's going to look like they get narrow together. That's something called perspective. I talk about that in my book, but basically it's the idea that as things get farther away from us, they get closer. So don't worry about that. Pick up your paper if you're nervous about it and look at it straight on like this, and you'll see that all of your lines are completely parallel, which means they're the same amount of space from each other. Now we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to turn my paper. I'm going to line my ruler up. And you know what, sometimes I like this top left corner to be like my first perfect square. So I'm actually going to do it kind of the opposite. I'm going to go this way. And again, it just needs to be somewhere near the top and somewhere near the bottom. You don't have to do it on that line or anywhere kind of specific. I'm going to do it just right here. Pull it down. Again, somewhere towards the bottom. Doesn't need to be on a line or anywhere specific. And you should have perfect squares if you did this correctly. Mine is going to be a 4 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, a 4 by 8 drawing, and I'll have some extra space on the side. Now we need to grid the drawing paper. I really like to just grid the entire paper and then erase the lines that we don't need. It gives us room to have some margins. I like to do little value scales and mess around and have some doodles in the margins. It also makes it easier to mat if you're planning on matting this piece to frame or to show in a competition. So this is a man-made cut of paper. I cut a sheet in half. So I know that this line is a little wonky. I'm not going to measure from that line. This line is more machine made. I can trust that line. I can trust this line. So I'm going to start over here. And remember, it's the same idea. You just need to have it somewhere near the top of the paper. It doesn't have to be at the very top. What we're trying to do is give ourselves reference points for the lines to connect. Stop right now and check to make sure that you're working with a number 2 pencil. At this point, put your colored pencil down. You're working with pencil. At some point, you're going to erase all of these lines. And I like to say it this way because it's kind of weird and people remember it. You want your pencil to barely kiss your paper, just a little peck, because you don't really want to make a dent that you can't get out later or one that's really hard to erase. Imagine that you can see the residue of black line right through the white of someone's eye. It's going to be super distracting. So I'm going to go through and really lightly mark my lines. Remember that it's not right above the number on most rulers, it's the largest line right there. And I've made sure that the end of my ruler is at the edge of the paper and that I hold my ruler down the whole time I'm measuring. I'm going to move it down to somewhere towards the bottom half of the paper. It doesn't need to be in any certain spot. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to do the same thing. If you or your student are struggling making a grid, I do have a grid cheat sheet on thisisnotasketchbook.com. It's also included in your packet for many of my projects. So to use this grid cheat sheet, you need a window or a light table. You're going to place it underneath the drawing paper or the photo reference, and then you can use a ruler to trace over top. It is color coded, but it's going to work just fine in black and white. Now that you have your photo gridded and your drawing paper gridded, I'm going to go ahead and figure out where our drawing space is actually going to be in this gridded paper, and I'm going to erase the rest. So I'm going to give myself just like a little bit of room over here. I'll give myself a 1-inch grid, press a little bit harder where I know I want the corner of my drawing to go. Now we've almost filled 4 boxes on the grid. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And I know that this is my 4th box, but my drawing only fills up about, what is that, like 2/3 of the box. So I can go ahead and make a line where I think it's going to be at 2/3 of the box. Now I'm going to count down 8. Let me double check that it's 8. And now I know that this is going to be the end of my drawing, but we have the same thing. We've almost filled the last square, but we haven't all the way. So I'm going to make a mark where I feel like the photograph ends in the middle of that square. It's pretty close. I'm going to find the bottom right corner and find the edge of that drawing. So now I'm going to go back and use my ruler, and I'm going to darken up the lines all the way around that drawing space. And then I'm going to erase the excess grid that we don't need anymore. I'm going to leave you here because the steps are really similar to what we just did. The only big difference being that you erase your grid after you transfer your value map. I'm going to go ahead and continue on with this drawing in the micro portrait series, which is the next video you can watch here. If you found this useful, make sure that you subscribe to me. That's the best way that you can support me so I can continue to support you. I hope art's finding you in the little ways. I hope good things are going on in your life, and I hope you're trusting the process and following the fun. Leave any comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.